So there you are, deep in the backcountry, waking up in your tent to the sound of loons on the water and birds in the trees just after sunrise. You had an okay night's sleep, not great, but not terrible. It's time to hit the trail. But first things first, coffee. And since you're camping, you need it to be quick and convenient. Well, Recess Coffee has you covered with their new Campfire Blend Steeped Packs. Steepable coffee packs, easy to carry in, easy to carry out. Pick up a carton of 10 or individual packs before your next camping trip. For 10% off your order of steeped packs or 12-ounce whole bean bags, use the promo code RECESS46. That's RECESS 46 at recesscoffee.com. This is the 46 of 46 podcast Summit Sessions, where we'll talk all things Adirondack, backcountry, and beyond. From high peak stories and adventures to trail tips and tricks, we'll dive deep into the heart of these mountains and the people who passionately climb them. Adirondack maps and spruce traps, bushwhacks and backpacks. It's all here on the 46 of 46 Summit Sessions. Hello out there, and welcome to another edition of the Summit Sessions here on the 46 of 46 podcast, where we talk all about different topics revolving around the outdoors or the Adirondack Park. And this week I'm discussing a topic that is near and dear to my own heart. Being a father of two little girls and a guy who loves to hike, we're going to talk all about hiking with kids. Clearly not a subject that's relatable to everyone out there, but I'm willing to bet, whether you have children or not, you'd be quite impressed with what some kids have accomplished out there on the trail, and especially here in the high peaks. Hiking with kids, whether they're 4 years old or 14, can be the most rewarding activity an outdoor-loving parent can embark on. Watching their child just crush miles and climb slabs that they never knew that they could, only to get to the summit and see that little twinkle in their eye as the child realizes what they just accomplished. Hiking with kids can also, however, be the absolute worst experience of all time, and can turn what would have been a fun afternoon in nature into the worst day ever, filled with tears and screaming from both you and your kids. There are a lot of ways to avoid this, however, and tonight I'm going to dive into this subject with guests experienced with hiking with children, hiking as young children, hiking with families, and get into the nitty-gritty of what we found to be successful when hiking with the littles. And since this episode is meant to shine as much light as possible on this subject, especially for people who have never hiked with kids and need some pointers to get started so they can hit the trail with their own children, I'm going to read off several tips and tricks to hiking with kids that many of you listeners submitted to me online. My guest is a licensed New York State guide, the owner of Muddy Boots Guide Services. She's experienced in guiding many families out on the trail. Oh, and she also started hiking in the high peaks with her dad when she was just 5 years old. And she was an Adirondack 46er by age 13. Pretty impressive stuff. So she knows a little bit about hiking with kids and hiking as a kid. Her name is Allison Cascade Kozel. And yes, she was indeed named after the high peak Cascade. Allison, thanks for coming on the 46 of 46 podcast.
Wow, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So your middle name is Cascade. There's clearly a story behind that.
There is, yes. My parents are avid hikers and outdoors people. My dad definitely was an avid mountaineer in the Adirondacks, and they actually decided to get married on Cascade, and so then they named me after the peak.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I just figured maybe they just really liked Cascade a lot. You know, most people tend to like that mountain, but that's a much better story. Perfect. So you started hiking with your dad super young. So you started hiking the high peaks when you were 5, and you became a 46er when you were 13.
Yes.
First of all, props to your dad for getting you out there on the trail so young. That's amazing. And that's quite frankly what everyone listening to this episode is probably trying to do. So that's pretty awesome. So what was it like that you can remember hiking in the high peaks at such a young age?
Well, it was awesome. I mean, my dad obviously really knew what he was doing, so I always felt safe and comfortable. I think he was always very aware of making sure that I was happy and having a good time, and worked really hard on keeping me motivated and educating me as we were going along. So, I mean, I think people always say, "We're like, weren't you scared as a little kid?" But I really wasn't. I think there were moments that you naturally were a little nervous, but generally speaking, like I didn't know any different. And if you don't know that you're supposed to be scared, then you aren't.
Sure.
So,
That's a good little tidbit of info there for sure.
yeah, definitely.
So what did your dad do? You said he kept you motivated. What, as you recall, like what were those little things he did for you?
Yes, it was. We definitely would talk about the hikes beforehand and kind of get pumped up about what the trip was going to be like, what the view might be like. Um, Sometimes we would talk about, what Gracie, Grace Udowski, she was really close with my dad, and
Oh,
so
cool.
she would share her stories often with us, and so that would get me kind of inspired and excited about what we were about to go into. And then on trail, he would kind of let me take the reins. I was always ahead and doing a lot of singing. Most people that hiked with me back then actually will first thing like recall that I was always singing Christmas carols up the peaks.
That's great.
Yeah, and then of course like Jolly Ranchers, as silly as it is, like that was such it would just keep me going by like giving me Jolly Ranchers, and the prospect of having like M&Ms at the summit was always huge.
Sure, sure.
So it's just little things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the episode, I'm going to read a whole bunch of tips and tricks people submitted, and let's just say there's a lot of candy in these messages.
Yeah,
So
I guess
that
kids
makes
are
sense.
pretty like food motivated.
So did you meet Grace Hudowalski at one point? Like for real?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
cool.
yeah. She was actually a huge part of my life growing up, and she was actually at my parents' wedding
That's
when
awesome.
they eloped and everything. Yeah, she was a huge part of my life and my inspiration overall, even into today. I often think like, it's what would Grace do?
That's cool.
In my thought process a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, like, for any 46er, you hear that name and you like she's, like a legend above all of us. But then you tend to forget, like, well, actually, a lot of people knew her because she was so involved right until the day that she died. So it's like she actually was a part of many 46ers' lives, and that's so cool. So cool.
It is. Oh, yeah, it's a huge blessing to have like known her so intimately.
Now,
So,
what year did
sure.
you finish your 46?
So 1995, and it was just about 2 weeks after I had turned 13.
Got it.
And my dad's goal was originally to have me finish at 12 on my birthday, and we ended up having really bad weather and just things were not working out. So we switched it to a couple weeks later, which ended up being also terrible weather. It was a finish on Colden, and it was like National Geographic winds and like rain, and just such a classic Adirondack High Peaks day, really, when I look back at it.
Cool. So now, what was it like being a young kid hiking in, let's say like the Santanoni Range or the Seward Range, those really down and dirty types of mountains? What was it like, especially back then in the, early to mid 90s?
Yeah, I mean, the trails are definitely very different now than they were then. Then there was usually a true herd path if you were lucky. And we really used a lot of map and compass skills to ensure where we were going. And one of my dad, like being an expert mountaineer, one of his like biggest like upsets was that he got confused in the Santanonis when we were together, and ended up like we got a little mixed up, but it took some extra time. But definitely totally different experience trail wise. never wanted to go back to the Santas after, and now they ended up being one of my favorites because the trails are so nice there now. But it was definitely, big backtracking trips where you would spend the night and, hike the next day and then come back down, camp again, and then go out the next day.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely like much harder experience back then.
Now, what would you have said is your favorite or least favorite? And also, too, what was the first one you hiked at 5 years old?
Cascade.
Of course.
Big surprise. And I mean, favorite and least favorite, I don't know. People always ask things like that. And it's like, each trip can be different. It can change your opinion of the peak. Some trips are really horrible, certain places because of the weather. Or just, even sometimes the company will make a big difference in how much more positive the experience is.
Do you remember any as a kid, though? Any as a kid in particular that you remember being maybe exceptionally more difficult than the others? Or did you not even process it
I think
way?
Seward Range for sure was difficult and challenging in that. All of that. The Dix Range, sections of that were really hard. It seemed like we often picked rainy weekends, so I feel like
sure. It is the Adirondacks. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we just never seem to get away from the rain. But when I was so little doing Cascade, I didn't even remember it until I was older and went back. But I think Gothics actually has been one of my favorites, kind of all around. That's a pretty consistent favorite, as is Haystack. Just like love
sure.
Haystack.
And do you remember, as a kid, your first round? Do you know what maybe your longest hike was? Like, what were your longest days? Were you doing, did you do the whole lower Great Range in a day with Sawteeth, which is a pretty popular one, or Marcy, Skylight, and Gray? Like, what were your longest days that you can remember?
I would say probably the Santanoni Range was definitely one of those longer, big deal trips. Just really hard, leaving early in the morning from Bradley Pond and then going up and coming back. And it's still being like, I don't know, a 14-hour day or something ridiculous. Mm-hmm. My dad also was a landscape photographer, so a lot of our trips kind of revolved also on coming out in the dark after sunset because
sure.
you have to get the sunset pictures.
Sunset shot, yep.
Yeah. Or same thing on the other end, getting a sunrise. So the days just always seem to be long. Mm-hmm. a lot of trips out on Lake Road in the dark.
Were you doing, did you ever have 20-mile days as a kid, or would you guys break them up much more?
Yeah, I think we really broke them up more to be more manageable. Those longer trips tended to become backpacking and overnight trips. Mm-hmm. We didn't really do, it just wasn't quite the same where you were jamming them out all in one trip the way that we do now.
Definitely. Okay, cool. So let's get into... So you're the owner of a guide service called Muddy Boots Guide Services.
I am.
And you've taken families out before. So in your experience and from your perspective, what have you found to be the trick to helping, young children on the trail, getting from the trailhead to the summit and back, especially people on their first hike?
Sure. Well, I really try and encourage people kind of away from taking their kids right up a high peak off the bat. I really try and push for getting people out, maybe at their local parks, state parks, and things like that first, so that they can kind of experience just what trail is like. How do their kids handle it? What's their attention span? And kind of like just navigating what works for their family and their lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I like to really take people up some of the smaller peaks initially with kids. I think the Saranac 6 is a great way of getting kids introduced to a little bit more terrain and height. But most of my families, I really try and take back to, Marcy Dam or just on some really beautiful scenic hikes. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things is people try and go too hard too quick with kids or assume that they can handle way more than they can. it's, I think, important for parents to